Awesome. Thanks everyone for joining. I'm very conscious it's very early in the morning on the last day of the conference, so I won't have you guys jump up and down out of your seats or anything like that. My name's Charlie, like I said. I'm the Director of Products at Reversing Labs. I specifically overlook our supply chain security proposition, SSCS, which is great because that's exactly kind of the subject matter that we're talking about today. One thing I thought we'd cover before I actually jump into the content is one basic kind of set of terminology that we'll be using throughout our session today. And that is that I am essentially bifurcating some of the key stakeholders that are involved in software supply chain security into two broad categories: publishers of software and consumers of software. So publishers are organizations that are developing, building, publishing software for some sort of external use by organizations or individuals. Then consumers are organizations or individuals who are procuring, buying, downloading commercial or open source software for some use internally. I'm conscious it's not always this clear cut, right? There are a lot of stakeholders that are involved in managing the risk associated with supply chain security, but hopefully this bifurcation will help us understand who are some of the main parties, and then what can each of those parties actually do in order to manage risk in a bit more of an efficient manner. To be quite honest, a lot of organizations are both. So 3CX is the perfect example of this. It's also the question I've got most frequently at RSA this week. If you're not familiar with 3CX, there was a breach a few weeks ago to 3CX, who's a software publisher. They had one of their flagship products, which is this desktop phone software, breached and had malware inserted into it, and it made its way into their customer networks. Mandiant was actually brought in to perform post-incident breach analysis, and what they found was that the initial breach of 3CX actually occurred because of a third-party piece of software that one of their employees had downloaded to their laptop, and it was a piece of financial trading software, for example. But the point is, organizations are susceptible to both upstream and downstream attacks, right? Like 3CX, where the consumption of software was actually the initial attack vector, but the fact that they published software was also taken advantage of by malicious actors to further the reach of their attack. Now that we have this kind of like concept of publisher and consumer defined, as we go through our content today, I'd urge you to think about where do you as security practitioners fit in the broader ecosystem? Are you a publisher? Are you a consumer in both? Or are you both? And what does that mean about your responsibilities for uplifting security and integrity? So we have a lot to get through today over the course of the next 40, 50 minutes. So wanted to give an overview of what we're talking about. We'll start with the introduction, very high level. We'll talk about kind of what the supplier ecosystem actually looks like and why software suppliers are specifically being targeted by malicious actors. We'll talk about threat landscape, specifically the breadth of attack techniques that malicious actors are using. We'll talk about industry standards and how they kind of continue to lag the reality a bit of the threat landscape. We'll talk about some actionable solutions that you can apply within your business as security practitioners, some key takeaways, and then I'll leave 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions if you can hold on to them until then. So first, what does the supplier ecosystem actually look like? You may have heard the term "no man is an island" before. The same is true for business, right? No business can operate in today's world without outsourcing certain aspects of your people, your process, or your technology. So regardless of what industry you may sit in today, you will undoubtedly interact with various of these supplier types that we have listed in the wheel on the left here. This is in no way a 100% comprehensive list, but hopefully enough to get your mind thinking about who do I rely on to operate my business every day. Now, each of these supplier types presents a unique risk to the business. So partnerships and joint business relationships, for example, may present a higher reputational risk if you're going to market together or co-branding a product with a third party. OEMs may present a higher geopolitical risk if you're reliant on a third party to provide raw materials that are only available in certain regions of the world. And those regions may be susceptible to wartime scenarios, for example. Myself and many security practitioners in the room are obviously likely biased towards information security risk. But that's for very good reason, right? Information security risk impacts almost every other risk type we have on here. So if we take a ransomware attack, for example, it's going to impact privacy risk, right? The risk that PII gets leaked on the dark web because you didn't pay your ransom. It's going to impact your financial viability risk, right? The loss of revenue from an attack, regulatory fines that come from a breach, or the need to simply pay your ransom to unlock your data. It's going to impact operational resilience risk. What happens if you have a supplier which provides a critical risk service to your business? They get hit with a ransomware attack, their systems get locked down, and they're no longer able to provide that service. I'll stop there because I could go through each of these. But the hope here is this will start to kind of trigger some questions in your mind. And the logical order those questions should go in is, what supplier types do I interact with? What unique risks do those present to my business? And then what am I actually doing from a testing, from a due diligence, from a assurance oversight standpoint to manage that risk effectively? Now, out of all supplier types that we're talking about today, we're focusing on software suppliers. Why is that? It's pretty basic. Software suppliers are actually the #1 target of attack by malicious actors in the supply chain right now. And there are a ton of studies to support this, but two of my favorite that I think highlight it best. The first is from a ENISA study, the European Security Agency, where they looked at, over the course of 12 months towards the end of 2021 and 2022, they looked at all attacks that happened on the supply chain over a course of a 12-month period. And what they found was that in 2/3 of all attacks, so 66% of attacks, the initial vector of attack was supplier software code. And you may hear that and say, Charlie, that seems like a very narrow issue, right? You're only considering attacks on the supply chain. What about all the other enterprise attack vectors that I need to protect myself from as a business? I'm here today to tell you it's not narrow at all, actually. So the other piece of analysis I love pairing this with is IBM. IBM does this annual cost of a data breach report that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. But what they look at is 3 characteristics of a breach. They look at average cost of a breach, frequency of breach occurrence, and mean time to detect a breach. And when considering all enterprise attack vectors, they actually found that vulnerabilities in third-party software ranked among top 5 of all threat vectors across each of those 3 characteristics. So when we combine those, what does that actually say to us? Not only is software a top targeted threat vector when considering all enterprise attacks, it is the top targeted threat vector in the supply chain that you need to worry about. And you may ask why, right? Why is it such a target of interest? Well, I have 5 kind of characteristics on the right that I'll go through each of these, which will help bring it to life a bit, hopefully. The first is dependencies on third-party and open source code. So we know today that a large portion of code isn't actually built by the publisher, right? It's built using or reusing open source and third-party components. And Synopsys does this really interesting report every year. It's called their State of Open Source Security, the OSRA report. And there was 2 really interesting takeaways. The first was that 97% of all code bases contain at least one open source component. And even more powerful, 78%, so more than 3/4 of the average code base was actually open source. So the point is, we're never getting away from open source code. And I wouldn't in no way advocate for that, right? It provides too many commercial benefits and the ability to get to market faster for software publishers. The issue isn't open source itself. It's that it's so inherently intertwined into modern application builds that organizations genuinely don't control their software anymore because they don't maintain a large portion of it. And that creates a massive issue in instances like a Log4j or a Log4 shell, where you have a critical risk vulnerability in a widely distributed and used open source component. It ends up extending the time it takes for publishers to actually fix the issue because they have a dependency on an external maintainer to actually fix it, right? They can't fix it themselves. The second characteristic we have here is extensive footprint and reach. So targeting software suppliers pays kind of dividends in 2 ways for attackers in this one. The first is pretty simple, right? If you breach a software supplier, you will get access to their downstream customer base, which SolarWinds is a great example of this, not only because of the sheer volume of downstream customers. It was something like 30,000 downstream customers that they got access to as a result of breaching them, but also the importance and stature of those customers, right? Government agency networks, financial institutions, critical infrastructure providers. The second part is, if software is pervasively distributed across an environment and you're able to breach it, let's say a XDR agent or an EDR agent that's pervasively distributed across all endpoints in a network, it provides a great avenue for attackers to enumerate and laterally move throughout that network. Third, privileged access exposure. Software often requires administrative rights to operate within an environment. So if you think about the last time you maybe downloaded a desktop package to your laptop or mobile phone, maybe it asked for your administrative password or your local admin password to actually install that. So once again, very enticing for threat actors who want to escalate privileges. Fourth, complex deployment and integration. This one's actually quite simple. So a lot of times when you install software, it requires you to deviate from some existing configuration standards or hardening standards that you may have set as an organization. And a lot of times organizations don't consider the downstream security impact that deviating from those baselines will actually have on your business. Unfortunately, the main drivers are usually let's get the software deployed as quickly as possible so our business can start consuming it. And then finally, the need for frequent maintenance, right? Software isn't this service-only relationship like a lot of these other supplier types we see, maybe a business process outsourcer. It requires constant updates, constant patches, constant maintenance. And those maintenance activities introduce risk. SolarWinds being another perfect example of this, right? Where malicious actors were taking advantage of the release window and using that as a vector to insert a backdoor into customer networks. So that brings us on to threat landscape. So it's clear, right? Software's risky. It's being actively targeted. Well, how are malicious actors actually doing this? Well, the biggest thing that jumps out to me is really the breadth of attack techniques that they're using and that they have available to them. The scope of the software supply chain is so enormous when you think about the number of third parties and fourth parties, vendors, subcontractors, whatever term that you want to use that are involved in the sourcing, the building, the packaging, the delivery of software to an end consumer. It's so large that it often becomes overwhelming to deal with. So it kind of begs this question, right? Where can organizations begin to understand and first start to manage that risk moving forward? Well, SALSA is a great framework for doing that. If you're not familiar with SALSA, it's been used by Google for various years in managing secure software development. It's now managed by OpenSSF through various working groups. But why I like SALSA is they actually provide this very nice diagram, this attack model, essentially, to help demonstrate the breadth of attacks that can occur across the software supply chain. Now, we can't look at all of them, but I wanted to bring a few of these attack scenarios to life a bit to help demonstrate this breadth of attack techniques. And more importantly, it will help to start us think about actions that we can do to protect ourselves, and more importantly for our group today, kind of what role does malware play in that landscape, and how does malware stack up against some of these other attack techniques that are being used. So the first one we'll do here is E, use of compromised dependencies. We're all likely familiar with Log4j at this point, so I don't need to belabor it, but it is a great example of the impact that a single dependency can have within an application. We already talked about the majority of kind of modern code being made up of largely of open source and third-party components. But just like any other process, any other function, any other components that you decide to strategically outsource as a business, you are solely responsible for the security risk that comes along with that, right? You cannot outsource security risk. You can mitigate it to an acceptable level and manage that risk using technology and internal controls. You can maybe transfer that risk by buying things like cyber insurance, but you cannot entirely outsource it. And we recently spoke about this kind of phenomenon with our board, who holistically agreed that given the kind of rise in visibility from governments and regulators around the world, if you as a publisher are not taking the necessary steps to secure software that you develop, and that includes third-party and open source components which make it up, even if you're not responsible for developing them yourself, it can certainly be treated as negligent all the way up to the board level in the event of a breach. And what does that mean? That means regulatory action, regulatory fines on your executive team and board's heads. And as a result, that's why we're seeing kind of software supply chain rapidly creeping up the agenda for executives. The second we have here is D, use compromised build process. So here we're going to take a look at the SolarWinds attack. It's quite different from Log4j, right? It didn't happen, or it didn't occur due to reliance on an open source package. It was much more sophisticated. It happened over the course of an 18-month period. And you'll see that sophistication start to come out a bit. That comes along with an advanced persistent threat, an APT like Nobellum, who's actually attributed with this attack. And that they're actually using 4 uniquely crafted strains of malware to deliver this attack. So I'll start at a very high level of each of these 3 stages, and then we'll go into each of these 4 malware strains in detail. The first stage we have here is that attackers were able to compromise SolarWinds build infrastructure. If you've been living under a rock and don't know who SolarWinds is, they're a commercial vendor of IT management software. But they were able to breach their build environment. They used this release and update process as a mechanism for delivering a compromised package to their consumer environments, essentially breaching this trust boundary we have, once again, between developer and consumer. That allowed them to deliver malicious payloads directly within the network of their customers, some of those, once again, being things like US government agency networks. And as we dig into each of these components now, you'll start to get an idea of how familiar this APT actually was with SolarWinds environment. So the first one we'll look at all the way on the left here is Sunspot. Sunspot was a strain of malware that was specifically designed to listen for a Microsoft Visual Studio product called MS Build. And it was essentially trying to understand when a build process was being triggered, meaning source code is actually being compiled into binary format. And it wasn't just listening for any application. It was actually specifically listening for Orion, one of their kind of flagship products, trying to understand when Orion was being built. And even if we go a step deeper, it actually wasn't just listening for Orion. It was listening for a specific component of Orion called the Inventory Manager. And what Sunspot did was it replaced this legitimate Inventory Manager component with a malicious component, in this case a DLL file, that had all the same functionality as the Inventory Manager component that it was emulating, but it had the second stage of attack, this Sunburst backdoor, hidden within it. Now this gets inserted, this gets digitally signed because it's coming directly from SolarWinds build infrastructure and sent to the customers. That takes us to stage 2, which is Sunburst. How does Sunburst work? Sunburst waits 2 weeks, essentially, and then it sends its first beacon to a command and control server that's owned by the malicious actors. It has this 2-week time delay, essentially, to avoid any association with the update that occurred, so it couldn't be found easily. It even goes a step further to evade detection by making sure that the beacons that it's first sending to its own command and control infrastructure actually mimic existing communication protocols that are already being used by Orion. So in this case, it was emulating OIP, Orion's Improvement Program. After it establishes that command and control, it starts collecting various information about the hosts that it made its way onto to determine, is this host potentially a target of interest for me? So it looks at things like OS version, username, is the host running any tooling on it that would be able to detect me if I found it? So it's looking for things like antivirus, anti-malware, EDR solutions, and so on. If it is determined to be a target of interest, it will then drop this third stage of payloads, which is Teardrop and Raindrop. And what those do is they download essentially adversarial tools like Cobalt Strike to allow you to actually carry out the attack. Teardrop is designed to infect a single device. Raindrop was designed to enable lateral movement across the network. You may ask, as a result of all this, right, 4 strains of malware were used, right? Surely someone would have detected this in some capacity. There's a lot of reasons why that actually didn't happen. The first is that this DLL, this malicious component that was embedded, that was emulating a legitimate component, was built in a way that it actually didn't break functionality or raise suspicion. So if you look at the source code within that malicious DLL, it was using a lot of the same naming conventions that were already found for code classes across the Orion database. So you can see how kind of intimately they knew SolarWinds environment. The second is that they were using very kind of advanced obfuscation techniques, things like file compression, base64 encoding schemas, different mechanisms to avoid traditional threat hunting detection mechanisms like Yara rules, for example. The third is it had a legitimate signature, right? It was signed through their build infrastructure coming from SolarWinds, so customers essentially had no reason not to trust it. It wouldn't have likely been picked up by any kind of consumer signature integrity check. The fourth is that, once again, as we talked about, Teardrop and Raindrop were designed in a way that they were only dropping the payloads on devices that they knew didn't have tooling to detect it. So once again, an EDR and antivirus wouldn't have found it. And then finally, fifth, most simply, Orion is incredibly complex, right? Orion itself has something like 100,000 components within it. So as you begin to kind of layer this size and complexity with a lot of these various detection mechanisms that occurred, you can start to understand why SolarWinds or any other publisher, threat analyst, or even consumer likely wouldn't have identified these very easily. Now, after this attack occurred, our research team at Reversing Labs kind of reviewed the differences between the legitimate version and the malicious version to see if we could understand the attack a bit more and then help prevent these types of attacks in the future. And we did this using static binary analysis, so essentially deconstructing the already compiled software binaries, performing byte analysis, and mapping binary strings to different inherent system functionality and behaviors that we know those strings represented from our kind of threat analysts and malware intelligence background. And we were doing this all with the hope of understanding, essentially, are there any behaviors or inherent system functionality that are being introduced as a result of this malicious update that we could flag. And a few did stand out. So you can see the indicators listed here on the right. I'll go through a couple of them. So enumerating system information using WMI. WMI is Windows Management Instrumentation. It's essentially a Windows utility that's used by IT administrators for remote device management. And so you may ask yourself, right, why all of a sudden, as a result of this new update, are we introducing things like the need to interact with remote systems? The second is enumerating user accounts and privileges. Pretty clear indicator that someone is trying to escalate privileges. And then finally, tampering with system shutdown, right? Another red flag are essentially malicious actors abusing unnecessary privileges. So you may ask, why is this kind of analysis necessary when considering software supply chain attacks? It brings us back to this fundamental need, right, to understand, is there a clear reason for new behaviors or functionalities that are introducing monumental changes to the inherent behaviors of software? Is there a need for them to be introduced as a result of this update? And if your own development team can't justify those changes and those introduction of new behaviors and functionalities, well, maybe an indication that has been tampered with in some way. The next attack I wanted to talk about is this CodeCov attack. So this is leveraging attack technique F in SALSA, use of a compromise, or uploading a compromised package. If you're not familiar with CodeCov, it's short for code coverage, another commercial vendor of software that essentially tells you the proportion of code that you're testing in your development environment. So the idea being the larger coverage you have, the more comprehensive your testing program is. There's a component in the larger commercial product called the bash uploader script. And what that script does is it gathers various data points from your development environment, sends it to an internal server, and then generates some type of coverage report for you. Now, what attackers were able to do here is kind of take advantage of what I'm calling poor development practices. So they were able to uncover plain text credentials that were unintentionally left within a Docker image within CodeCov's environment. They extracted those credentials, were able to laterally move and gain access to this bash component. They then modified that component, and you can see the modified script on the top right here. What they did is they actually added their own IP address to a command and control server that they managed as a location to exfiltrate data to, so that once data was harvested by that bash uploader script, instead of being sent internally, it was sent externally. A key point to take away here, this is not actually an isolated occurrence of kind of secrets or sensitive information being unknowingly scattered across corporate networks. Back in my time in security consulting at a Big Four firm, I worked in various purple teams, so essentially doing adversarial type exercises with ethical hackers and incident response personnel. And the first thing our red team, or ethical hackers, would do when they got access to a network was they would mount and scan internal network file shares, essentially looking for any sensitive information like plain text credentials that they could use to carry out their attack. And if you think about a software package is just a culmination of thousands, hundreds of thousands of files in some instances, right? So what we're seeing is malicious actors starting to realize that software packages can also be a source of a wealth of information, of sensitive information that was never properly managed. And so we're seeing a shift in technique, and instead of targeting file shares and network shares for sensitive information, malicious actors are looking at software as well. The other point to make here is it's quite interesting in this example, similar to the SolarWinds example, where Attackers aren't taking advantage of known vulnerabilities, right? They're not taking advantage of a known CVE. They're not using known malware strains to detect this because there's been no signature created with this sort of malware. They're essentially living off the land, using unprotected credentials to gain access to a component of the larger application, and then inserting legitimate and novel code to essentially allow them to do something malicious. So once again, similar to SolarWinds, you can't detect this using antivirus, anti-malware, vulnerability scanning. You can't detect it using anti-malware solutions, like I said, because there's no signature associated with it. The only way to really detect these style of attacks is to understand the behaviors of software, and then over time understand if it's changing. Are there any deviations from the intended purpose of the application? And once again here, you can see that we've extracted a few, the most obvious of which is that the last one here, that all of a sudden, as a result of this update, we see that the application is now uploading files over the internet, over HTTPS, to a remote IP address, right? A pretty clear indication that some sort of data exfiltration is happening. The last one we have here, the last kind of attack technique we'll talk through, is use of a compromised package. That's H. So that's kind of the last step prior to distribution of a package to the consumer in the software development lifecycle. Here we're seeing a slightly newly emerging attack technique known as a dependency confusion attack. So this attack was actually identified by our threat research team at Reversing Labs. You can see on the right there were more than 100 packages that were impacted by this, over 17,000 downloads within the first couple months of identifying it. A key component of this type of attack is typo squatting. So if you're not familiar with typo squatting, it's traditionally used in web browser attacks where a malicious actor is trying to lure victims into clicking links that are slightly misspelled, right? So google.com with 2 zeros instead of O's, for example. We're now seeing the similar deception technique being used in malicious actors and trying to get organizations or individuals to download malicious packages, which are emulating legitimate ones, or masquerading as legitimate ones, but are slightly misspelled, or maybe they have the wrong version added to it, a more recent version that hasn't been released yet, hoping to entice you to download that into your environment. And so the attack path you can see here is that we have the creation and publication of a malicious package to NPM, a popular open source Java repository. The user downloading that package for use directly off NPM. So if they're a consumer, maybe they're downloading it for consumption in their organization, or if they're a publisher, they're going to integrate it into a larger commercial product they have. The process of avoiding various detection mechanisms to being deployed in production, where it can start harvesting data and send it and exfiltrate it to a command and control server. So very similar attack cadence you're seeing once again, but just with a slightly different spearhead and using open source repos as a way of delivering this malware downstream. Now, yep, here we go. This kind of begs the question, so where is tooling actually falling short here in detecting some of these malware attacks specifically? We're going to continue with Icon Burst, this last attack we just talked to as an example. And I won't go through all of these because we've talked about a few of these already, but just to give you a taste, we're seeing shortcomings and using various point solutions. So just using SCA tools, software composition analysis tools. Those often result in an SBOM being created, a software bill of materials, right? Which is essentially going to give you a list of components and dependencies, which make up a larger application. And then sometimes it will also give you vulnerabilities associated with any of those components or dependencies. It's a very good first step in understanding what's in your software and if it kind of presents any risk. And it will help, it will help also prevent against those Log4j style attacks, which we just talked about. But beyond just vulnerabilities, SCA actually doesn't tell you anything about the components themselves, right? It just tells you that they exist. But it doesn't tell you anything about the origin or the trustworthiness of those components, just that they're present. So other characteristics that you should be looking at, right? The origin of the component, the maintenance history, the details of the maintainer or the publisher, essentially various characteristics that will help you avoid these typo squatting style attacks. Another solution that people tend to default on is, oh, well, I have antivirus, I have anti-malware, right? Surely I'll catch any of these 4 strains that come through my environment. The truth is that traditional and even next-gen antivirus are massively restricted on file size limitations, so they can only scan upwards of 200, 300, 400 megabyte size files. And that becomes an issue because most modern software packages are extremely bloated, right? I was just downloading PowerPoint, for example, the other day. It was something north of a gigabyte on itself, not even the entire Office kit, right? So they're not designed, these solutions are not designed to detect risks in the modern application landscape. So we've talked about the breadth of attack techniques that could occur across the software supply chain. The next logical question is, how are these actually differing in frequency of occurrence? Well, our threat research team came across another really interesting study that they helped carry out, essentially looking at all supply chain attacks on the open source ecosystem dating back to 2010. So over the last decade. And when specifically focusing, once again, on this open source ecosystem, so looking at software package managers that are popular, like NPM, PyPI, and RubyGems, they found that the volume of targeted attacks, so those attacks like SolarWinds, CodeCov that we just talked about, and those that use malware as the spearhead, so IconBurst, another one we just talked about, almost double the number of packages that are impacted solely by a known or reported CVE, so like the Log4j example that we talked about. And there may be many reasons for this. The first is that likely CNAs, so CVE numbering authorities, the groups that are responsible for identifying and reporting CVEs, have a lack of focus on vulnerabilities in the open source ecosystem. But ultimately, this highlights kind of two important issues that I wanted to share with you. The first is that I believe there needs to be this reprioritization and reallocation of resources within SCRM, AppSec, TPRM programs that focus on these targeted and malicious injection style attacks rather than just the hyper focus on vulnerabilities that really exist. And we'll get to that in a second. The second is that CNAs and the NVD more broadly need to consider expanding the scope of what actually gets designated as a CVE to cover the full breadth of security exposures, which is the E in CVE, rightfully so, to include these other types of attacks that we're seeing. Once again, malicious injections, secrets exposure, sophisticated tampering attacks, all those of which threaten the integrity of the software supply chain. I'm conscious of time. We don't have a lot left, so we have this full blog in detail if you'd like to read more about the analysis. I have it linked at the bottom. I'm glad to share it separately. The final slide we have here before talking about solutions is industry standards. So I've had the joyful job of digging through various publications, frameworks, best practice publications that have come out around software supply chain to help our customers understand how they can meet industry needs and industry requirements. I say joyful because I'm sure like all of you, you've likely been overwhelmed by the dizzying amount of guidelines that have come out over the software supply chain over the last 12 months. But the ultimate theme that we noticed when starting to dig into these is that there is this hyper focus on vulnerabilities that exists. And there's no framework that demonstrates this better than the NIST 800-218 or Secure Software Development Framework. If you're not familiar with SSDF, it is kind of what NIST sees as the de facto framework for securely developing software. It's been noted in almost every publication by the US government, probably the most recent of which is the National Cybersecurity Strategy. But what we found when analyzing NIST specifically is more than half, so I think it's like 10 of 18 practices within NIST, explicitly focus on the protection, the detection, the remediation, prioritization of vulnerabilities within software. Protection against malware or targeted attacks that we've just talked about, or tampering attacks, isn't actually mentioned once. And so we believe that given these kind of recent findings, that this overly targeted prioritization of vulnerabilities doesn't really match up with the active and targeted threat landscape that we're seeing. So we've submitted this feedback to NIST through a feedback solicitation process, but I just wanted to flag it to all you so you're aware of the gap. Taking action. So what are some actionable solutions that you can actually take away from today so that you can help contribute to fixing this problem within your business, within the broader ecosystem? Now, I'm conscious of this kind of very broad attack surface that we just discussed, that there's no one single point solution that is going to do this for you, right? So I wanted to caveat this whole section with, yes, there are likely some basic governance or process-oriented actions that you can take, things like if you're a consumer doing a vendor security questionnaire, if you're a publisher doing stuff like peer code review, right? These things that are going to be covered by every best practice framework out there. So I didn't want to focus on that. Instead, I kind of wanted to focus this section on what are those more impactful activities where you can really leverage kind of technology and automation to keep pace with this evolving threat landscape. So I put them into 4 categories. The first is verifying the components that are within a software package. We slightly touched on this before, but the main mechanism for doing this is generating an SBOM, understanding the components and dependencies that exist within software that you're either publishing or that you're consuming. For each of these components and dependencies, there's various characteristics you need to understand about it. Once again, are they coming from a trusted source? Are they the components that you actually intended to use? And the truth is there's actually some really good resources to address that need. So Google, just a few weeks ago, actually announced their new Cloud Assured OSS project. It's essentially like a public repository of packages that Google has used and vetted themselves that they're making publicly available to the broader security industry so that you can leverage an externally trusted repository of open source packages. So keep an eye out for that. Finally, you need to, once you understand those components, you need to translate them into business risk context. And so you need to do this last section, evaluate key component risks. I won't take credit for these suggestions. These are actually all from a bill of law that was proposed to US Congress back in September, I believe. But they're looking at various aspects of the component. So breadth of deployment of an open source package or open source component. So how widely distributed is this component? We talked about this before. Is it something like an XDR agent that's on every endpoint? Security properties of code for a given component. Are they written in things like memory-safe programming languages? Level of risk associated with where it's actually deployed, the location of deployment. So is it at a network boundary, or is it somewhere more sensitive, like a privileged subdomain within your environment? And then finally, kind of the level of current and historical investment and maintenance, things like frequency of activity updates, how long a software has been supported for, and the number of maintainers and other aspects like that. Second is hardening the build environment. This one is specifically for publishers. Hardening your build environment is one of those basic security hygiene activities that you can do to quickly uplift security and integrity of your environment. There's obviously no one single thing you can do, so I tried to grab those 6 most impactful. This is actually, each of these 6 are not from me, once again, myself. They're from one of my favorite industry guidelines. So this is published as a part of a 3-part series by ESF, the Enduring Security Framework. It's a working group of various government agencies, so ODNI, CISA, and NSA. But they give a ton of very helpful and very approachable controls that you can deploy within your build infrastructure to protect yourself. So things like enforcing MFA for developer accounts, minimizing and regularly auditing a service accounts, and so on. Third was identify and block suspicious behavior. So we talked about this already, right? The importance of not only targeting and understanding the behaviors that are being performed by a piece of software and if they deviate from the intended purpose of the application. So is your tax software recording keystrokes or deleting files? But also, how is that changing over time? And are any new risks being introduced as a result of these update processes or these maintenance activities that are traditionally targeted by malicious actors? And then finally, and lastly, proactively hunting for malware within your software. So using tools like file reputation and threat intelligence and YARA rules, for example, to actually actively identify and find malware before, rather than hoping that your downstream security tooling like antivirus and EDR is eventually going to catch it. Things that I said before weren't really built for the modern software application. And then finally, key takeaways. This is just really a recap of everything we mentioned. So malware is outpacing vulnerabilities as the #1 vector of attack in the supply chain, especially in the open source ecosystem. And we saw this through some of the research we walked through. Industry standards are lagging behind what we believe is the reality of the threat landscape, and we see this through this hyper-focus on vulnerabilities that exist that we need to pivot away from. And if we do want to keep pace with this kind of evolving threat landscape, things need to change, and that ultimately starts with taking some of those actions that we talked about. Hardening your build environment if you're a publisher, understanding what's in your software and the risk that presents to your business, understanding the behaviors of software and how those change over time, and then once again, proactively finding malware and looking for malware rather than hoping you're gonna detect it after the software's already been deployed. That's all the time I have for today. I will stop there and open it up for questions. Thanks. And I think we have mics at the front if anyone does have questions. And if I don't get to it, if we don't have time, I'm more than glad to stay around and answer any questions you may have. Go ahead.
Yeah, excellent presentation. I think the only area that I guess I have a question on is about the NIST 800-218. You mentioned that the focus on vulnerabilities. I know like Enduring Network is focused a lot to map to that particular framework, and that's something you like as well. So I'm just curious, anything you can recommend to folks here that we should look at beyond SSTF as a framework? It's a pretty good framework.
Yeah.
And even like other organizations, I'm getting mapped to that. But anything, so this is I just don't want people to walk away thinking this is not gonna work for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely agree. And there are a lot of frameworks that are broader in coverage and still reference a lot of the good stuff. I actually really like this publication. The only thing I don't like is that I find it's too focused on vulnerabilities. The one that I mentioned before very briefly is the Enduring Security Framework. So it's a 3-part series that essentially provides guidance for what they break up into 3 groups that I break up into 2, but publishers of software, developers of software, suppliers of software, so it's likely like value-added resellers or people that resell software in some capacity, and then consumers or customers of software. And what it does is it actually breaks down the delineation of responsibilities across each of those groups, which I think NIST fails to kind of meet sometimes in other frameworks like SALSA. I know I had SALSA on here, for example, but this is another one of the things I like talking about. But if I go to SALSA, SALSA is one of those frameworks that, like many other frameworks, states that it's built with the intention of helping developers and consumers alike manage the risk of software supply chain security. But if you look at SALSA, just like a lot of these other development frameworks, secure development frameworks, it only takes you up until the point of delivery of a software package to a consumer. So if you're a consumer, you're left with virtually no guidance of how do I manage security risk after I actually procure a third-party or open source software package. So they're kind of left in the dark, which is the very beginning of the consumption life cycle for a supplier. So I really like ESF because it goes a step further and says it's not only a publisher issue, it's also a consumer, it's also a reseller issue. And so it links a lot of that together. But it still references like SSDF and other frameworks like that. But I agree, I don't want to speak poorly about NIST. I think NIST is one of the few organizations that has done a ton for software supply chain security, so I really appreciate everything they do.
Are you familiar with VEX and its approach, and do you think it's something that's going to address some of the issues you presented here?
Absolutely. I'm actually a contributor to VEX, so I'm a part of a lot of the discussions they have. If you are all not familiar with VEX, VEX is the Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. It's this initiative that's put on initially by NTIA, but has been taken over by CISA and various industry security practitioners like myself. It's essentially a mechanism that allows publishers of software to say, yes, I recognize that as a part of the components and dependencies that exist within my software, some of them may be vulnerable, but because of the way that, I don't know, maybe that component doesn't sit in the execution path of the way I built my software, it's not actually exploitable, and therefore it doesn't present any downstream risk to you as a consumer. So a VEX statement is something that says, yes, I have Log4j, but it's not exploitable. Therefore, you can deprioritize that or triage that. So VEX, I think, is a huge step in the right direction of taking this vulnerability issue and saying, look, we're likely going to find thousands of vulnerabilities in every software package. How do we equip ourselves with the information that we need to help triage those and prioritize so our efforts are spent well? There's a couple other things beyond just VEX that will help you get there as well. So CISA also has this thing called the KEV catalog, the Known Exploited Vulnerability Catalog. Will help you take that a step further. Once again, if I do find vulnerabilities in my software, are they actually exploitable or not in the first place? Not because of the way they're built into the application, but because of how, I guess, fresh they are or how people are taking advantage of them. So it may just be that the vulnerability is conceptual in nature and never actually been taken advantage of. So that's another good resource that people can use to help prioritize vulnerabilities and spend their time on stuff. There's one more actually really interesting piece that I didn't mention today, but Ponemon Institute did this really interesting report. It was called the State of Vulnerability Management in DevSecOps. I think they just released it this year. But they had a really interesting finding that essentially said that 50% of vulnerabilities that actually get identified, so more than half of the vulnerabilities that get identified during DevSecOps practices, don't actually make it out of the backlog, right? They never get actioned. So it brings us back to this point, like you're always gonna find vulnerabilities. That doesn't mean that you've been breached in any capacity. It means that you have a higher susceptibility to be breached. My point is that malware, like I mentioned before, is a much better indicator if you're really taking a risk-based approach that you have been breached or you are likely to have data exfiltrated out of your environment of some case. But yes, I'm a big supporter of VEX. So if anyone wants to talk about that, I could probably talk your ear off. Any other questions? Amazing. Well, thanks for joining today. Like I said, I'll hang around for a little bit longer if you do have any other questions you'd like to discuss.